Hey guys, it's Bella. Welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all having an incredible day today. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the Truro Murders, which is one of South Australia's biggest and most notorious serial murders. Between December of 1976 and February of 1977, Christopher Worrell and James Miller murdered 7 young women in South Australia. Because of this, the name Truro will always be notorious and will forever be associated with one of the worst mass murders in Australian history. Before we get into the case, I just want to thank today's sponsor, Casetify. I mean, duh, you guys already know I love Casetify by now. They are the only cases I use on my phone. I got 4 of the leather cases, which are just so luxe and beautiful and classic and timeless, and I'm obsessed. I just feel like these are the kind of cases that will never go out of style, and they're just gonna go with everything. There are 8 different colors in the leather cases, and you can also personalize them with your initials, your name. You can even monogram them, so they would make the perfect personalized gift for friends and family too. So I got a black one because you just can't go wrong with a plain black case. I also got this beige one because, again, this is so neutral, it's just gonna go with absolutely everything. And I also got that same color just with my name down the bottom. And then last but not least, I got this really cute pink one with my name in a contrasting yellow color down the bottom. I'm obsessed! The leather is also biodegradable and it's made of 90% recycled materials, and the packaging is made of 100% recycled materials, which I just think is amazing. And it also features Defensify, which means it has an antimicrobial coating on it, which helps kill 99% of bacteria. So if you guys are interested in checking out any of the Casetify cases, you can get a cheeky 15% off if you go to casetify.com/Bella. I will leave the link and all of the information in the description down below. And speaking of cases, let's go ahead and get into today's Mystery Monday case. 23-year-old Christopher Worrell was born in Adelaide on the 17th of January in 1954. He never knew his father, and by the time he was 6, his mother had remarried. In his teens, he joined the Royal Australian Air Force, and he spent some time in Victoria and Western Australia. Apparently, he also admitted to killing 2 girls while traveling from Western Australia to South Australia, but there's no evidence this actually happened. After serving in the Air Force, Worrell moved back to Adelaide to live with his brother Danny for a while, and I guess kind of like went off the rails. He was described as charismatic and sociopathic, which I feel like are 2 very contradicting descriptions, but it is what it is. While there, he was put on a suspended sentence for rape charges, which he eventually broke when he was found guilty of raping another girl, and the judge described him as depraved, disgusting, and sentenced him to 3 years in Yatala jail. 40-year-old James Miller was born Melvin Raymond Juss in 1938, but changed his name to James Miller, which is actually the same name as the founding father of Truro. He was known as a bit of a loner, he didn't have any friends, and he ran away from home at an early age, and by the time he was 11, he ended up at the Maggle Reform School. Starting in his teenage years, Miller gained an extensive criminal history with over 30 convictions for car theft, larceny, breaking and entering, and stealing, and from age 20 to age 40, he actually spent more time in jail than out. He ended up meeting Worrell in Yatala jail after being sentenced to 3 months for breaking into a gun shop, and while in prison, the 2 formed a sexual relationship, and Miller was actually known as the slut of Yatala. Oh my gosh, these earrings are actually hurting my ears. Ooh. After Miller's 3-month stint in jail, it wasn't long before he was back serving an 18-month sentence for trying to sell 400 pairs of stolen sunglasses to different hotels around Adelaide. 9 months after Miller was released, Worrell was granted early parole, and the 2 met outside of jail and pretty much became inseparable. They lived in various different locations, but always together. They would always share the same accommodation and even slept in the car together sometimes, and they also continued a sexual relationship. When I say Worrell too much, it's like Worrell, 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 Worrell. Miller would give Worrell oral sex while Worrell would read like BDSM magazines and pornography. But over time, their relationship fizzled out because Worrell did prefer women, so eventually they just became kind of more like brothers. Their killings began on the 23rd of December in 1976 when Worrell was 21 years old and Miller was 38. 18-year-old Veronica Knight had a pretty difficult childhood. Her mother died shortly after she was born, and she was taken away from her father because he was a severe alcoholic. She spent the majority of her life in care at Brighton's Minder home, which was basically for kids who couldn't be placed with a foster family. In 1974, when she was 16 years old, she met Peter and Jeanette Woods at an Anglican church youth group, and over the next 2 years they grew super close, and Peter and Jeanette were really the closest thing Veronica ever had to family, and they helped to mentor and guide her through her final teenage years. Veronica was described as a confident, sociable and kind girl, and by 1976 she was living in the Sutherland Hostel. On the 23rd of December in 1976, 18-year-old Veronica Knight went out with a friend to do some last-minute shopping before her trip to Melbourne to go and visit Peter and Jeanette. While she was out shopping, she got separated from her friend and ended up accepting a lift home with Christopher Worrell and James Miller. Once she got in the car, the two men drove her to Swamp Road near Truro, and a lot of the details of these attacks come from interviews with James Miller, so I guess just take them with a grain of salt. He claims once they stopped the car, he got out and walked away, and he said he was gone for around 20 minutes. It was while he was gone that Worrell all of a sudden attacked Veronica. She struggled hard and fought for her life, but in the end, Worrell overpowered her, tied her up, raped her, and then strangled her to death. When Miller returned to the car and found Veronica dead, he confronted Worrell, but Worrell pulled a knife on him and threatened to kill him too if he didn't help dispose of the body. So together they dragged the body over to where a couple of trees were, and they just put some branches and some sticks on it, left her body there, and drove back to Adelaide. Within 24 hours, Dorothy Reed, the matron who ran the Sutherland hostel Veronica had been staying at the time of her disappearance, contacted the police to report her missing, and police just kind of said, oh, you know, she probably just ran away, and they didn't really look into it. Dorothy badgered police for some time after this to get updates on the case, but the missing persons report just got shelved and they never really looked into it. After Veronica's murder, Worrell and Miller kept driving around Adelaide, mostly looking at bus stops and train stations for their next victim. And on the 2nd of January 1977, they came across 15-year-old Tanya Kennedy. Tanya had been staying with some friends in Victoria Harbour just after Christmas, and on the 2nd of January she just hitchhiked back to Adelaide. James claims that that day he dropped Worrell at Rundle Mall and went for a drive, and then when he got back to the mall, Worrell was with a girl. Worrell and Tanya got in the car and Miller drove them to his sister's old house, which was an unoccupied house in Woodville. When they got there, Miller stayed in the car while Worrell and Tanya went inside, and while inside, Worrell attacked her. Miller said he heard a scream a little while after they went inside, and when he went in to check it out, he found that Worrell had strangled Tanya to death. He said that she had a sharp line around her neck, which indicated that he had used like a guitar string or something similar. It was still light out when this happened, so Miller and Worrell locked the house up, drove to an old rifle range in Wingfield where they dug a shallow grave. They then went and got Tanya's body when it was dark and took her back to Wingfield to bury her. That night, when Tanya didn't get home, her parents weren't like crazy worried or anything. They just assumed that she had gone to stay at a friend's house for the night. But the next day, when they still hadn't heard from her and couldn't get in contact with her, they went to the police to report her missing. And police did look into the case, however they didn't connect it to Veronica Knight's disappearance at this point. Julie Makita was born to Anne and Mike Makita, both of whom were teachers. They were a close and loving family, and Anne and Mike really trusted their children.
We felt that the values that they got from us would keep them safe.
On the 21st of January 1977, just 19 days after Tanya's murder, 16-year-old Julie had been working at a part-time job in the city and called her parents that night to let them know she'd be getting home late. By 9 p.m, she was waiting at the bus stop outside a hotel on King William Street, and it was then that she was approached by Christopher Worrell. He offered her a lift, and she accepted. Miller was driving once again, and he drove them to a secluded spot in Port Wakefield, and he reckons when they got there, he got out and went for a walk, as he always seems to do, conveniently. While he was on his walk, Worrell attacked Julie while in the back seat and tried to tie her up, but somehow she managed to escape and ran towards the nearby paddock. Unfortunately though, Worrell caught up with her and tackled her to the ground. Miller claims that he heard Julie struggling and returned to the car to find Worrell pinning her down on the ground. He claims that he tried to pull Worrell off, but that he wasn't strong enough and that Worrell threatened to kill him once again. So as Miller watches on, Worrell holds down the terrified Julie and strangles her to death. The two men then put her body in the boot of the car, drove her to Truro, put her body on the ground and covered her with sticks and branches. The next morning, Julie's dad Mike woke up, and initially he was actually pretty mad at her because she hadn't come home and she hadn't contacted him to let him know that she wouldn't be coming home.
So the afternoon of that day was the last time we saw her alive. The next morning, I found that she wasn't home. I was angry. I was angry because she hadn't rung. I was angry because it was very much unlike her.
But then by midday, when he still hadn't heard from her and couldn't get in contact with her, he started to get really worried. So he called around to all of her friends, none of whom had seen or heard from her. And so immediately he contacted the police. And the police in this case, I mean, it's just really frustrating because they told him, oh, you know, she's probably just with a friend or something. Oh, you know, maybe she ran away. You know, teenagers always do that sort of thing.
I got the usual story of I had $1 for every worrying parent whose child hasn't come home for a while. You know, I'd be a rich man and all that sort of thing. So they didn't really take us seriously.
You know, just the usual sorts of things police seem to say in these missing persons cases. Around 2 weeks later, on the 6th of February, Miller and Worrell found their next victim. 16-year-old Sylvia Pittman was waiting for the train at Adelaide railway station when she was approached by Worrell, who offered her a lift to wherever she was going. She accepted, and Miller drove them all to Wingfield. When they got there, Worrell told Miller to go for a walk, and while he was gone, Worrell raped and strangled Sylvia to death in the back seat of the car. When Miller got back to the car about 20 to 30 minutes later, Sylvia was already dead. He drove them to Truro, where they dumped her body and covered it in branches and sticks. And then within 24 hours, Miller and Worrell struck again. On the 7th of February, Worrell told Miller to meet him at the Adelaide post office at 7 p.m, and when he arrived, Worrell was with Vicky Howell. Vicky was a 26-year-old woman who was in a bit of a slump in her life. She had just separated from her husband after an unhappy marriage, and she was just kind of going through it, you know? Worrell had convinced her to go on a drive into the Barossa Valley, and she had accepted, so Miller drives them out along the Barossa Valley Highway until they get to Nuriotpa, and Worrell instructs Miller to pull over. When they stop, Miller got out and went to the bushes to go to the bathroom, leaving Worrell and Vicky in the backseat alone. Worrell then attacked her as she fought for her life. He tore her pantyhose off and used them to strangle her to death, and when Miller got back to the car, Worrell was already covering her body with a blanket and told Miller to get in the car and drive. The two men argued a lot about this matter. Apparently, Miller thought that Vicky was a nice girl who didn't deserve to die, but Worrell once again threatened to kill him if he disagreed with him or had anything to say about the murders, so they drove to Truro and dumped the body and covered it in sticks and branches before heading back to Adelaide. Just 2 days later, they attacked again, so by this point their killing spree is really picking up the pace. I guess they thought that they'd gotten away with it so many times that they just felt invincible and decided to amp up the pace. So 2 days later, on the 9th of February, when they were driving around Adelaide City, they came across 16-year-old Connie Laudanides, known to friends and family as Connie Jordan. Miller's story is that while they were driving around in the city, they got pulled over by the police for like a defect notice or something, and as they were pulled over, this girl Connie walks past and Worrell just cannot keep his eyes off her. So when the police eventually leave, he tells Miller to go and drive up to her, and Worrell starts chatting her up throughout the window and asks her if she wants a lift. Connie accepts and she gets in the front seat, and instead of heading to where they had promised her they were going to go, Miller instead drives the opposite direction towards Wingfield. When they get there, Miller got out of the car and where do you think he went? For a walk. While he's gone, Worrell attacks Connie, rapes her, and strangles her to death. Miller heard her screaming and returned to the car, only to find that she was already dead and covered with a blanket in the back seat. The men then drove to Truro and disposed of her body in the same manner as the previous 5 victims. They then drove back into Adelaide and slept in their car that night at Victoria Park Racecourse. 3 days later, in the early hours of the 12th of February, Miller and Worrell were driving around Adelaide City when they came across 20-year-old Deborah Lamb trying to hitchhike on Hindley Street. They pulled over and offered her a lift as far as Port Gawler, and she accepted and got in the car. When they got to Port Gawler, Miller, as usual, got out and went for a walk. Conveniently. Again. Deborah's murder was the most violent so far. Worrell attacked her, dragged her from the car, forced himself on top of her, tied up her hands, and then put a gag in her mouth. He then took her pantyhose off and wrapped them around her neck and head 7 times. He then dragged her body into a small sandy alcove, and it was found later that she was actually buried alive. A week later, on the 19th of February, Deborah Scouse had just recently left her boyfriend, who was a criminal, and had met Worrell and Miller in jail, so she knew the two men through her ex-boyfriend. And that day on the 19th, they went to her house looking for her ex-boyfriend and found her alone and offered to take her away for the weekend to Mount Gambier. While they were down there, Worrell got into this really bad mood. He got really super angry and decided they should all go back to Adelaide. After having a few beers, Worrell decides to drive them back instead of Miller, who normally drives, and he was, speeding, he was driving really crazy, and the three of them actually got into an argument over how crazily he was driving, and then one of the tires blew. Worrell swerved to avoid oncoming traffic, and the car rolled over multiple times. Witnesses rushed over to help, but it was already too late for Worrell and Debbie, who were killed in the accident. Miller, however, only suffered a broken shoulder and was rushed to hospital with shock. A few days later, when Worrell's funeral was held, Miller obviously attended, but while he was there, he spoke to one of Worrell's former girlfriends named Amelia and just told her everything, told her all about the murders. He told her that it was getting worse lately, that it was happening more often, and that maybe it was a good thing that Chris died. But she didn't actually go to the cops or anything at this time. After Worrell's death, Miller became really depressed after losing his best friend and, his lover, and he actually ended up becoming homeless. 14 months after Worrell was killed in the car accident, Veronica Knight's remains were found. On the 25th of April in 1978, William Thomas and his wife Valda Thomas were out in a paddock near Swamp Road looking for mushrooms just outside of Truro when they came across what they thought was animal bones. They went home that night, but Valda just had a really bad feeling about the bones, so she went back the next day, even though it was an hour away from where they lived, to just check out the bones again.
She couldn't sleep and she was getting premonition that someone was calling her back to go back there, which she ignored initially. The next night the same thing happened. This feeling was so strong that they were compelled to go back, which is an hour's drive.
That's when they realized that the bone had actually been attached to a shoe, and inside the shoe was a human foot still with skin and painted toenails all attached. They also ended up finding clothes and blood stains and more bones nearby, and so they called the police. Upon looking at the bones, police determined that they were likely the remains of a teenage girl, but due to the state of the remains, they weren't able to determine how she died or how she even got to where she was. The bones were collected and brought back to Adelaide, and dental records were used to confirm that the body was that of Veronica Knight. Police, though, really didn't think much of it. The area she was found in could be pretty harsh, hot, and dry conditions, so they thought that maybe she just walked off into the bush, became disorientated, and died due to the elements. Died of thirst, and that's it. It wasn't until a year later when police got another lead which actually prompted them to look into the case. On the 15th of April in 1979, 4 bushwalkers discovered the remains of 16-year-old Sylvia Pittman about a kilometre from where Veronica's remains had been found. With the 2 bodies found in such close proximity of each other, police finally started to connect the dots. They then organised a huge search of the area to see if there were any other bodies there, and that's when they found a skull on the opposite side of Swamp Road, and it was pretty open to police, to the point where police were like, how did we not see that? It's literally just sitting there staring at us. It wasn't covered or buried or anything, which makes sense because a lot of the time Miller and Worrell would simply just put branches and sticks over the body and that was it. And then not long after that, during their search, they also found the remains of a 4th body. Both bodies were in an advanced state of decomposition, and so once again they had to use dental records to identify them, and they were then positively identified as that of Vicky Howell and Connie Jordan. All victims were found partially buried in the same area, and so police now believe that Veronica was the first of the girls to be murdered. Serial killers were like a pretty new phenomenon in Australia at the time, but after finding these 4 bodies in such similar ways in the same area, police now believe that they were dealing with a serial killer. Within hours of discovering the remains of Vicky and Connie, the media was all over the case, and over the next few weeks, police received hundreds and hundreds of calls with possible leads. Over those few weeks, police weren't really getting anywhere because, there wasn't really that much evidence besides the actual bones themselves. But then police look into this report they received about the death of a former prison inmate, Christopher Worrell. When they look into him, he obviously has been convicted of multiple violent and sexual crimes, and they find he was killed in a car accident at around the same time as all of the murders of these young women stopped. So police appeal to the public and they offer a $30,000 reward for any information that could lead to the killer. And that is when, in May of 1979, Worrell's former girlfriend Amelia collects a $30,000 reward and tells police that she had heard from James Miller that Worrell had been raping girls and dumping their bodies up near Truro. She claims the reason she didn't come to the police sooner is because there was no proof that what Miller was saying was true, and also because there was no point in going to the police because Worrell was already dead. Which, I don't know if I share the sentiment. I feel like even if the killer's dead, you still want to give the victim's families closure, so you should go to the police, right? Seems like she maybe just came forward for the $30,000. But either way, I'm just glad she came forward because without her, it's likely the case never would have been solved. Based on what she told police, it was obvious that Worrell and Miller were the guys that they were looking for. So they went and they tracked down James Miller and arrested him and brought him in for questioning on the 23rd of May in 1979, and at first he denied knowing anything about the murders at all. But then eventually he tells police, I should have done what Amelia had done, and he kind of confessed everything, but he denied having any involvement in the killings themselves and said Worrell was solely responsible for raping and murdering the girls. When Detective Glenn Laurie decided it was time to charge Miller, they took him down to the charge room, and within 3 minutes, Miller told them, hey, there's actually 3 more bodies and I can take you to them. Under police escort, he's driven to Truro. 5 kilometers past Swamp Road, on the left-hand side, down about 1.5 kilometers, he directed police to turn into an old abandoned farmhouse where the body of Juliet Mikita is found. He then takes detectives to Port Gawler, where Deborah Lamb was buried, and because it was so dark, her body was actually really hard to locate, and police began a detailed search, and once they found her remains, it took them more than 2 hours to actually dig her body fully out. While that was happening, Miller was then driven to Wingfield, where the body of 15-year-old Tanya Kenny was found. Her remains were found at the Dean Rifle Range at the end of a track leading to the target mound. It's nearly dawn when James Miller is driven back to police headquarters and formally charged with the murders. On the 12th of March in 1980, he was found guilty of 6 counts of murder, 1 count for each of the girls he murdered except for that of Veronica Knight. For the 6 murders, he was then sentenced to 6 life sentences. His parole was set for 2014, but he died of cancer in 2008 after serving 24 years in prison. And he was actually the longest serving prisoner in South Australia before his death. While in prison, he actually wrote a book called Don't Call Me Killer, and the description of the book is The Truth of Truro, a chilling testament from a prison cell by the lifer who helped his lover bury 6 of the 7 murdered girls. Despite his conviction, most people believe that there's more to the story than what he said in his confession. A lot of people believe that he was involved, that he wasn't just going on these walks every single time and letting Worrell murder someone in the back of his car and then coming back and being like, oh, they're dead. You did a bad thing. And then Worrell threatens him and he helps Worrell, go and bury the bodies or whatever. People just believe that he was downplaying his role in the whole thing because he had nobody to discount what he was saying because the person he did it with was dead. Deborah Lamb's daughter, Nikki Lamb, said that she 100% believes that Miller was involved because she didn't think that just one person could hold her mother down. But that is everything for this case. I would love to discuss your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you guys think about Miller? What do you think about his confession? I think he's a total load of horseshit. 100% he had way more involvement than he's claiming to have. There's no way he was just going for walks and that's it. And even if that did somehow happen to be true, he's still just as bad as Worrell because he knew exactly what was going to happen. He still drove Worrell and these girls knowing Worrell was going to kill them. But I would love to talk to you guys about it in the comments down below. Let me know your thoughts and I hope you guys have an incredible rest of your day. Hopefully I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!